All right, I'm joined by Nate Lawrence. Nate Lawrence is a bioenergetic thinker. I think the first thing I saw by you, Nate, was that 3 minute Ray Peat video. I believe that was the first thing I saw by you. And then I went and listened to your hour-long talk on digestion, which is on your YouTube channel. And
Yes, yep.
I've also listened to your appearance on a number of podcasts. I've listened to your um, spaces with brute de force, which I was also hoping we could talk about brute as well
Yep,
later
yep.
on. So yeah, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, bro. I actually, it's funny because I saw your YouTube originally. I saw I forget exactly what video, one of your Nietzsche videos, and I immediately was drawn to it. And I actually didn't even know you were on Twitter. And then I think a while after, it was maybe like around 2022 that I found you. Then, of course, we kind of brushed into each other posting in the similar Twitter X space. So yeah, it's been cool, bro.
It's actually funny you mentioned that because I reckon I got into Ray Peat in part through reading Nietzsche because in some of his works, like Ecce Homo, he places like a great emphasis on the link between physiology and philosophy. And not even joking, he talks about digestion and metabolism,
Yes.
right, in a philosophical way. And that kind of led me to Ray Peat. I found Ray Peat fascinating and interesting because of his commentary on things like art and education and employment and how all of these things in a way were linked with this this concept of metabolism. So anyway, let's start super basic. What's like Ray Peat's central insight? You know, you kind of touched on it in that 3 minute video, but what is the sort of central philosophy?
Yeah, well, the main thing is Ray was studying biology and literature in college, and I think throughout that process, he started to put together a almost picture of life and nutrition and physiology and art. And I think his main thesis was essentially energy and structure are interdependent at every level. So I always look at it in the sense where when you see energy flowing through any system, whether that be a living system, whether that be a societal structure, all of these different forms of energy and structure reinforce each other. So almost, I saw this particularly focused on my own health, and past that, really my ability to work on things in life. So I kind of came at Ray's ideas through the lens that the flow of energy is the only thing really to focus on. And I think Ray kind of put that in a way where biological energy, it's the thing that essentially leads to this is my interpretation that leads to almost an unconscious way of life, really, where action is happening effortlessly and things are able to be assimilated and digested and converted quickly. And then the quicker, the higher the metabolic rate, the more is able to flow through life. And it's almost like you can look at it, because I always give like an example. I think it's like you can look at it in a tree where it's building its roots when the sun is shining down on it, and it's up, flying, or it's not flying, it's up and it's spreading and it's taking in more energy and accumulating it. And it's, I think, no different with the human, and it's almost no different with any sort of process of art or any project that humans are working on. And I think that was really what Ray was most interested in. But he saw, I think, nutrition and physiology as really the way to interface with that. I think he said something along the lines of like, he liked talking about nutrition because nutrition is essentially a political, economical focus. So it's almost like a lot of indoctrination or control happens through, I think, biological mechanisms. And his focus seemed to be that that was the way that you could um, alter your life and really maximize your existence.
Yeah. I it's like that hippie idea that everything's energy, man. It's like that. But the thing is, you look at physics, right? And if you said that to a physicist, like everything is energy, they would actually probably say, yeah, that's true. But in the field
Yep.
of biology, There's less emphasis on that. But really, what it comes down to is yes, everything is energy. It's can when you see someone and they're flourishing, what you're essentially looking at is someone with high energy and abundance of energy. And we can look at creativity and we can look at art and we can look at philosophy and we can interpret all of those things as a sort of abundance of energy. When someone has so much energy that it just starts flowing out and they begin creating things. And that's essentially what like evolution is. And that's what progress is. And then, okay, if that's what it is, if everything is energy, and we think about that biologically, we suddenly start to realize how important the metabolism is, because that's the furnace that converts food, right, into energy. And if that's inhibited, well, then suddenly you enter a low energy state or a low vibrational state and you stop being productive. And okay, I don't want to get into this whole seed oils. Everyone knows they're bad, yada yada yada. But what I found interesting was this idea that polyunsaturated fat essentially is used by even animals to enter a state of hibernation. So, like bears, for example, before they, or like any animal that's going to enter into a hibernation state during the winter, they seek out foods that are naturally high in polyunsaturated fat and that helps them slow down the metabolism and enter that sort of hibernation state. And then it kind of makes you think, well, we've got these toxic engine lubricants in everything, and we know that they're slowing down the metabolism. And even just outside of that, we know that there's a number of things about the modern world that are sort of inhibiting the metabolism. They're inhibiting our capacity to produce energy, and that's leading to a sort of stagnant culture where it's less productive, it's less creative, and we need to sort of think about, well, hang on, what can we do to improve energy? And that's not hippie, it's actually a very practical, real question. Like, how can we improve digestion? Like, that's what you talk about, like, in that hour-long talk. How can we improve our digestion? That's going to improve our energy. It's going to improve our creativity. It's going to improve our life.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's funny because you say like the me talking about digestion. I almost think that any sort of stagnation in terms of culture can be explained by biological symptoms in humans, and it's almost like looking at the temperature and pulse or the basal metabolic rate is, I think, a great way to tell what's going on in the organism. And I think a lot of people have the ideas surrounding discipline and effort and force and what it takes to cultivate something in life. I think they have it really, really backwards. And to me, I think any sort of forcibly cultivated I essentially think that if you could address the symptoms of your organism of impaired energy flow, there's not really much else that you need to do. Everything sort of exemplifies your own nature, and almost the unconscious takes over. And that was a huge thing for me. It's essentially like stagnation of resources or the slow system of capitalism is essentially just brought forward and through this inertia of the biological impairment. But again, it's interesting to me to think about why that started in the first place. But it's certainly a very, very complex process going back and forth between, like I think it could really be seen as oxidative metabolism, which essentially is the abundant thyroid function, or stress metabolism running off of like cortisol, adrenaline, estrogen, a few other stress hormones. But it's funny because almost these stress hormones in like the Petarian community are viewed as evil. Like people say, oh, estrogen and serotonin, like they need to be nuked to zero. I think that this sort of stress system is here to serve as a stimulus to reinforce oxidative metabolism, and that to me is kind of like the idea that there's a spiral upwards where life is always in an imbalanced state, and there's a good reason for that because that's what promotes energy flow. So yeah, it's I don't know if that's making sense, but
No, the thing is, um, so what you said before about energy and structure being interdependent, right? I never understood that when I heard Pete say it or other people say it. What made me understand it was your video, um, which was on a sort of a river, if you will. Like it wasn't a river, it was at a beach. But that analogy actually made it click for me, right? Where you could imagine a stream and it's blocked up. There's all of this stuff, right? So maybe it's wood, it's trees, various things are preventing the flow of water, which is obviously analogous in this case with energy. And if you were, like you do in that video, to start clearing some of that stuff out, you would find that the water began to flow a little bit better. And the flow of water is actually self-reinforcing. That
Yep.
the more water that flows, the bigger the bank becomes, right? It's like yeah, so that's kind of what you're talking about, clearing it up. And again, that sounds abstract in a way, but it's actually very, very practical and concrete. You go,
Yeah.
you have indigestion, and one thing I love in that digestion video is you constantly come back to um, how we use this. This is like a metaphor. We like we could talk about a creative block, like you're blocked up, right? Like how our metaphors kind of um, are very much in line with this reality.
Completely. Yeah, it's funny, like, because I actually read, I haven't read much Nietzsche, but I saw an excerpt of him talking about digestion. And essentially, I think he said something to the effect of, like, the constipated philosopher is just full of cliches, or almost like that's like really, I think, so simple to see for someone who's experienced sort of health issues. But if a person hasn't dealt with that firsthand, it's very difficult to kind of get a picture of it. But it's funny, like it's almost like, well, what's even the cause of impaired energy flow? Okay, how do things accumulate in the first place? And I think thinking that the metabolic rate regulates everything is an important piece, but also the toxins in the environment are 100% something as well. Because of course, anything I think an issue of anything accumulating is ultimately an issue of metabolism, but there are things that are slower to metabolize, and essentially that inertia will add to the whole problem. So yeah, it's kind of complex once you look at it on a larger level, but just looking at it on the individual level is, I think, really one of my main focuses. Because when a person can regulate that within themselves, it gives them the power and mental energy to move on to um, the more exciting things in life, moving past this block of staying within your organism. Because I think ultimately that's what a health issue does, is it turns you inward and you're not facing life anymore. I think it's ultimately like kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs to a degree.
Yeah, that you're stuck in sort of like a lower state. And I actually always thought about that in terms of like maybe people at like a lower civilizational state, right? Where even take the hunter-gatherer, where um really everything is just basically focused on survival, right? That you're if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're just at that first rung of surviving. And that in some ways could be explained like by chronic starvation, right? That you don't have that excess of energy to then go and begin producing art and producing other things.
Yes, totally. Yeah, because I think almost like a person will have that energy within them always, but it's just about whatever can convert it. Like, because for me in particular, I've had ideas of posting kind of this style of what I work on for quite a while, and it wasn't really even possible for me to actualize it until I started to deal with my health, and it was almost I had no option but to deal with it. And I think that is part of it. Like I do think necessity is, or what Plato said is like necessity is the mother of invention. And I definitely think that's the case.
Well, you could think about it like um, you place this great emphasis on intuition, which you link with energy flow. And I feel like if you're in that first rung of Maslow's hierarchy, where you're focused on just surviving, which could be like the literal example of a hunter-gatherer who is spending, 12 hours a day more or less trying to just simply survive. You could imagine that really all they have time to do is think about get food, get food, get food. They're stressed, and that's all they can think about. All of their focus is on that. Um, and then we have the modern equivalent, which is someone who's being bombarded with chemicals, with food that just can't go through the system quickly, that takes a long time to digest. And then really they're sort of just in this the stressed like fearful rat state where all they can think about is utility basically. And then I think once you overcome that, that's when you enter the creative state.
Yes, totally. Yeah, because it's almost like you need to move through the process, and there you can't skip steps. It's physically impossible, you know? And there's good reason for that, of course.
Mm. Well, it kind of, this is in a way, it naturally leads to like a conversation about brute force because you've obviously found parallels between Brute's way of thinking and Ray Peat's. And if we think again about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is something that Pete talked about a lot, at the top you sort of have purpose, right? Which could be described as the mission, right?
Yeah,
So you need to
exactly.
overcome, yeah. And then in order to have that mission, you need to first satisfy a number of other things. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about the parallels that you found between Brute's ideas and Ray Peat's.
Yeah, it was a while ago that I found Brute, and I think I really just saw him in kind of the money Twitter space. And after seeing more of his tweets, I kind of realized that he was ultimately getting at these same ideas, these same bioenergetic ideas. And it was really interesting for me to see the way that he spoke about things in a sense of gambling as really his main thing, or for anyone who knows him. But he was getting at this bigger philosophical background of it, and I think his focus was the whole time just the flow of energy, and he didn't really have the um because he's definitely versed in physiology and health and vitality, but I think once we got in contact, there was just a really good dynamic there, and I've been really blessed to get to talk with him and stuff like that, and kind of put these ideas together with him. So it's really huge for me because I think the first time I spoke with him, it was I jumped up in one of his spaces and I asked him about I think it was he has the idea of the mission, and I think it's always important to have kind of a base of physical health before you get to that point, kind of like what we're talking about with the hierarchy. So I actually brought that up to him, and he said he 100% sees that, but really the point where you're generating in life is a catabolic state. You need to expend energy. But it's funny because it goes back to metabolism, which is essentially just burning energy to create more structure in life. And it's so funny because that's exactly what I was using to move myself forward with really intuition, just dealing with my health. It became, I had multiple doctors that I spoke to. I had people in my life that were trying to tell me what they think is the best thing for me to do. And I knew the whole time that what they were telling me was not applicable and just that it wasn't really helping. I would still go through the motions, and it just kept leading me towards my gut feeling. And really, it's funny, that's the issue. That was the issue too. And it's almost only unlocked through dealing with that. And that's kind of what leads you to the mission. And like, I think anyone who finds their mission, they realize that you don't choose your mission in life. It
Hmm.
chooses you. And I think for myself, it was a health issue. Other people, it could be another sort of kind of transcendental moment that kind of tears them apart, but really gives them life after that.
Yeah, well, I actually want to hone in on this instinct thing because I think again, like another little parallel between Pete and maybe Nietzsche is like this admiration for the child and seeing like the child as in some ways the ideal state. That the child is obviously instinctual, right? That they're far less likely to outsource their thinking in a way. I don't know if that's actually true, but they're much more likely to be instinctual. Everyone would agree with that. And also, you're likely to see a child running around in winter in just a t-shirt because they're so hot because the metabolism is firing and they can eat whatever they like. They don't really put on any weight. So they've obviously got this high metabolic rate and they tend to be very instinctual. And I think there's a lesson in that, right? That when the energy is flowing, everything is seamless. But when things are blocked up, I think that's when you're much more likely to start outsourcing your thinking to other people, to overthinking, right? Which in some ways is overthinking. Analysis paralysis is basically just indigestion in a way. It's like mental
Completely.
indigestion. Yeah. So I think this idea that you have about instinct, right? That when you've sorted out your health, when you have that baseline of physical health, things become more and more seamless. And you could imagine that the ideal state, right, would really be not thinking whatsoever. In a way, it would be everything seeming seamless and instinctual, and basically you just go from action to action, and the course you sort of always know which way to go in a way.
Totally. Yeah, it's almost like I see the whole point, like, because my idea with intuition is I think the like dictionary definition is that intuition is the ability to understand without conscious reasoning, or it's something along those lines. I tend to think that the definition of intuition should really be the ability to make decisions beyond conscious reasoning. And I think
Mm,
it's important to emphasize the beyond because I do think that there is almost a sieve that you can run ideas through that is reasoning and that reinforces intuition. And like I see that as the process of metabolizing essentially. But like what you brought up with the youth is something that's always been so profound to me because I think really what youth represents in the high metabolic state is this form of kind of purity of really no accumulated toxins, no accumulated stressors. And that's, I think, something that becomes more and more difficult to cultivate or maintain the older that you get, really just when the stresses of life accumulate. But the whole point is to strive for this youthful state, to strive for this energy flow. And I think that's really why we're drawn to like things like the sun and sugar and novelty. And it's almost like there is no reason that that can't be the default state of existence up until death. And I think the degenerative conditions now are being seen in younger and younger people. And I don't think any of that is natural. I think 100% people should be able to do what they want to do up until their deathbed. But we're seeing kids who are essentially, like you said, the fearful rat, the stuck in learned helplessness, unable to really act on what they want to do with their lives. And is if you could figure out where energy has gone static in your own life, it's ultimately the thing of just becoming in tune with your senses, your perception, and that's kind of part of what Ray had his idea of. If he said if there's one protocol, he thought it'd be perceive, think, act, and it's to me ultimately the idea of following your intuition is there is a degree of reason, but reason is only here to reinforce intuition. Intuition comes before that. So yeah, it's interesting to me.
well, something that dovetails well with that is in your first space with Brute, you spoke a little bit about maturity, and you had some very insightful remarks. Maybe you could just repeat them here.
Yeah, I think I was saying that really the youthful state I think is the whole point in life, and the most mature people I think that they're calcified in their minds and static. There's really not anything admirable about that at all. And all of the creative and artistic people, all of the successful people, they are maintaining this ability of change and adaptability, and that is the youthful state. And I think anything becoming set in its ways and concrete is really just a sign of sickness, and that's essentially getting close to death. Like Ray talked about the idea of calcification, where cells generally accumulate calcium over the course of their lives, and that's where you see happening when stress is high. And degeneration, I think, is a very slow process, but there's a lot of ways that you can prevent that through the nutrition. And I think that was the biggest thing that I got from Ray.
Yeah, I deeply resonated with that because just thought about how like a lot of the time what maturity amounts to is like paying your bills in time, following like a set routine, essentially avoiding spontaneity, right? Like around certain people, if you were to say, hey, you know what, let's just go here, let's just go do this, right? Without a moment's notice, without a plan they would sort of laugh at you, and they would view spontaneity itself as a form of immaturity, right? But actually, that sort of spontaneity is a sign of life, like it's a sign of energy, and that sort of I don't know what it is. A lot of the time, maturity, quote unquote, is basically rigidity. It's just synonymous with rigidity, right?
Totally. Yeah, it's I think a response to dealing with stress. Like to me it makes a lot of sense where if you've dealt with a stressful situation, you are in a sense locked in to where that is. It's like kind of the hibernation state that we were talking about earlier.
And then I think that one of the key mechanisms, right, or one of the key things that I've learned from Ray Pete and others, is that, stress, cortisol, is in a sort of seesaw relationship with thyroid, and thyroid's inextricably linked with metabolism. So stress, chronic stress, absolutely tanks your energy levels, and that I think, like you said, when people have accumulated stresses and they start, hitting their maybe 30s, 40s, but like you said, even now it's people in their mid 20s. Like it's not uncommon to see people in their mid 20s with a lot of these symptoms, right? This rigidity, um, this sort of antagonistic view of spontaneity. And that's just a sign that, hey, because of the toxins, because of the food, they're sort of reaching that degenerated state a lot quicker.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's funny, Georgy Dinkov, who's another bioenergetic researcher, he had a really funny anecdote about this where he was saying like if you were to say poke like a young kid, they would probably poke you right back. They'd probably treat it as a game. And if you were to poke a adult, they'd probably try to punch you in the face. And it was pretty funny to me hearing him say that, because I think it's really a
Oh,
great example.
think about school, right? Like everyone had, or not had singular, everyone had many of these teachers where they would take even the slightest joke, right, as a total affront to their authority, and they get so up in arms about, even the smallest little remark. And that would often be like that's the stereotype, like the old hag, right? The old hag who even the smallest affront, or they see people skateboarding in a certain place, and that to them is like extremely offensive. You know what I mean? It's very much seeing any sort of like playfulness as almost like a form of criminality. That's very much a feature of aging and degeneration, right?
Totally. Yeah, it's the longhouse. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but it's like I think really everything could be in this playful state. Life does not need to be brutally serious. And when it is, that's usually to me a sign that there's not the metabolism working correctly.
Mm. All right. So we'll segue into like a bit of a new topic now. So we've kind of talked about some of the signs of high metabolism, right? We've spoken about playfulness, like you spoke about the kid. If you poke it, it pokes you back. It's playful. We've spoken about the fact that children, again, who have a high metabolic rate, they can run around in winter with a t-shirt on and they don't feel the cold because, again, the furnace is firing. And another sign we've spoken about would be creativity, which is an abundance of energy. If you're in that lower rung and you're just worried about like your survival, essentially, you're not being creative. You don't have the energy for that. And another sign of low energy is rigidity, following routines, having to like sort of really discipline yourself and force yourself to do things. Not being able to follow intuition, that's another sign of low energy. What I thought we could maybe segue into now is how do we actually increase our energy? So some people listening to this will be like, oh man, like I agree with what's being said, but I notice, I'm often extremely cold when perhaps I shouldn't be. I notice like, I'm less playful than I used to be. What are some ways that they can sort of increase their energy production? Like, where should they start?
Yeah, I think really the first place to look is digestion and cutting out things that pretty much make you feel bloated or irritated. And I think the easiest things to focus on are like the wheat and flour and bread and even just starch from potatoes and rice can be irritating for people. And I think a lot of people now are starting to deal with things such as like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where soluble fibers and starches can feed gut bacteria and lead to really just impaired thyroid function. But again, I think something like impaired digestion does start with the thyroid at first. But I think like focusing on simple sugars from like fruit, juices, honey, is really a good thing, and lowering gut irritation from essentially just the idea is to just perceive, think, act, and really understand how you um, feel from foods. I think elimination diets could be useful, but I don't think it's a thing to stay on for a long time. I think people are probably familiar with carnivore diet, but I'm not generally too much of a fan of that. But I do think it can be helpful to remove things from the diet and kind of become more in tune with the ins and outs and how you react to things. But yeah, I think lowering digestive irritation is a good one.
Uh,
And on top of that would be like gelatin, which I think is a huge thing that can improve that and also support thyroid and support the liver, which is involved in supporting metabolism. And gelatin came originally from like the gelatinous cuts of meat from animals. And I think most people might be familiar with the idea of a nose to tail eating, where we're eating more parts of the animal, and gelatin has unique proteins that are essentially anti-inflammatory. Glycine and proline are two of these amino acids, and they can help to support the gut and lower inflammation. So that's another big thing that Ray was a fan of. Um, yeah. I don't know if there's anything I think we're gonna cut in or something. Or...
yeah, I was going to cut in to say, like the prevalence of IBS. So you mentioned like bloating, but I think like now, huge number of people suffering from irritable bowel syndrome, right? So that would be a telltale sign as well, would it not?
Completely. Yeah, it's like it's almost become so normal that people just accept their poor digestion as like a process of like normal aging, which is so insane to me because I think a lot of people will go to a gastroenterologist or doctor and they'll get diagnosed with IBS. And that's, I think, almost like a useless diagnosis because there could be so many different causes of IBS and it doesn't really narrow it down at all. So I think that's why it's important to really just be aware of how often you're going to the bathroom. If you're constipated or have diarrhea, I think there's different things to try, such as like the carrot salad, which people might be familiar with, which is like a one raw carrot, which has like a antimicrobial effect due to the carrot fibers. They can pull out toxins. and you add a tablespoon of coconut oil or extra virgin olive oil. That also intensifies this like antimicrobial effect and helps to promote gut motility. And then 1 tablespoon of white vinegar and then a pinch of salt. And what that does is essentially just promote gut motility mechanically with the carrot fibers. And then the different like dressings, they will also help to kill bacteria. And that's really, I think, the best thing to try as like a first thing for digestion. And there's, I think, some other substances that could help to help the gut. Like there's like white button mushrooms, but yeah, that's I think a little getting more deep into it. But even just like coffee is I think a thing that could be useful for people supporting metabolism. But I think there's a lot of uh not necessarily a lot of, but there's definitely people who think, oh, well, doesn't coffee raise cortisol or isn't it stressful? And I definitely think coffee should not be drinking on an empty stomach. Drinking coffee with enough nutrients, such as with a meal or with like milk, heavy cream, and or sugar, I think is really important to um, support the ability to use it. So it's not like coffee is actually a fuel source, but it increases your metabolism. So if you're supplying nutrients, that will help the process. And I think coconut oil is another good thing for people to try. Just like even adding just a tablespoon of coconut oil throughout the day seems to have a huge impact for a lot of people and just raising their temperatures. And coconut oil is an easily metabolized form of fat. And I think that's one of the main reasons it's so beneficial for metabolism. And it also helps to increase carbon dioxide. So that was actually carbon dioxide is something that Ray would focus on with this like oxidative metabolism where thyroid helps you produce carbon dioxide and then carbon dioxide helps your body to use oxygen. So the glucose and oxygen are what are involved in producing ATP and then this reinforces this whole cycle. So yeah, I think those are some good things, but yeah, in terms of like uh different foods, I think like red meat and dairy and the easily digestible fruits and simple sugars are really I think what should take up the bulk of a person's diet. And it's really just about being perceptive of how you feel and what you really want to eat because I think every craving does have merit, but it's important to be aware of foods that will support your energy and structure and then foods that will satisfy that same craving but actually deteriorate it. Like I think it's it's a process that takes quite a while, but it's like William Blake said, the true method of knowledge is experiment. So yeah, it's definitely good to just try as much as possible, I think.
You think about gut feeling, how we say that expression, like a gut feeling. Obviously, again, that metaphor uh, is insightful. It gives you an insight into a biological mechanism, right? Because if the gut is inextricably linked with digestion, which is inextricably linked with energy flow, which is linked with intuition, as we said, and I don't know, you think about diarrhea, like that, like what that feels like, and what's happening in the gut, right? Like just how that could be messing with, yeah, more things more generally. And another thing I wanted to say is, I don't know if I've got this right, but stress, even if the diet was on point, right, and you were eating things, if you're being put in a situation that you don't want to be in, you're in a very stressful work scenario, for example, you might find you have IBS even if everything else is on point. And that's because I think the mechanism basically is um, digestion is actually a energy consuming process, right? It takes energy to consume energy. And I think what essentially happens is the body says, you don't have time to digest this right now. It's essentially a fight or flight response. It's like, you don't have the time to digest the food. You need to just expel it so you can focus on the task at hand. Is that kind of what's happening?
Yeah, I think so. And it would also involve the kind of composition of different bacteria in the gut, kind of interacting with that. But yeah, it's like people, I think, into bioenergetics almost forget sometimes that the brain is the master regulator of metabolism. So, like, if you are in a poor environment, I don't think you can really do anything for your nutrition that will um, actually change until you move out of the environment. So I think like the whole point of nutrition or the whole goal should be that it gives you the mental energy to move into new territories and move into places that you want to be and pursue things that you want to pursue. And yeah, it's definitely a it's definitely I think hard to just say that uh, you have to move to a new place or you might need to quit a job or have a tough conversation, but leaning into anything that gives you the mental energy, I think is the best thing. And that's what I find helpful from the different supplements or foods that Ray would talk about for particularly lowering the stress hormones like cortisol, estrogen, and serotonin. Probably the one of the probably some of the three main ones, but yeah.
Hmm. So we talked about some of the foods. Another thing that I want to speak to you about was actually environment, because it's clear that a bad environment can inhibit energy production just as much as a bad diet can. And I don't know if you see these debates that go on Twitter about like rural versus city living. Like it's one of these debates that comes up again and again, and there's partisans on both sides. But I just wanted to get your personal thoughts here. Like how you feel like, do you feel like for you being in a city is more generative, or do you find being in the country in a more like a natural environment more generative?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think we kind of talked about this a bit earlier. Like living in a city for a young person, I think is a really, really useful thing. But again, there's all of the issues of the toxins in the environment and the pollutants and EMF and all the crazy people. But I think almost if you have the energetic resources to take that on, I think it's almost always good to put yourself in situations of chaos because I think a lot of good things will happen from that. But again, it's about making sure that you're following your intuition because for someone in a worse state of health, I think avoiding chaotic environment can be extremely therapeutic. And it's definitely just about knowing your nature and trying to become in tune with who you are and where you've become a person and where your upbringing was and just following again, like I say, your intuitive feeling. That's ultimately at the core. But I think like in terms of living location, Ray actually talked a lot about high altitude living. And the whole purpose of living at a high altitude is um, the oxygen pressure is much lower and the carbon dioxide content is much higher. So the longevity of people who live at altitude is significantly higher. There's been several studies on this, but Ray focused on it because, like I mentioned earlier, the carbon dioxide helps your body to use oxygen, and that's really the main therapeutic thing. So if a person could live somewhere at a high altitude, I think that would be amazing, and of course somewhere that would be sunny and I also think a dry climate is something that would be supportive to metabolism. But yeah, it's of course not practical for everybody to, pick the perfect environment, but learning how to work with where you are is always a good thing.
Yeah, I think about the that rat study on like population density and social pathology, right? Where they put these rats in very dense living conditions, and they found that that brought a number of pathological behaviors to the surface, right? So, for example, I don't know. I haven't read that for a long time, but I believe what happened was that like there's more like androgyny or more androgynous behavior among the rats. The female rats become more aggressive. Fertility rates drop. Things like that. I mean, I think that like that is undeniably a feature of like living in a mega city. I think that that is one of the features. But as far as the debate goes, like I think people often like romanticize country living, and even on like a biological level, like a lot of these country towns are actually more polluted than cities because of various like chemical sprays that they're putting on plants. So I feel like as always, right? Like there are some. It depends on the person, it depends on the city, and it depends what part of the countryside you're talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that because I never even thought about that. Like, at least living in New York City, where I lived for, I think probably about 4 or 5 months, I pretty much had to take aspirin, methylene blue, and vitamin E to combat the pretty much stress of the environment. And I think like those three actually could be extremely useful for a person dealing with environmental pollutants for essentially protecting your body and supporting immunity and supporting energy production throughout that. So I think also another thing to keep in mind. Because I think it's inevitable that people are gonna wherever we are, we're gonna be in a toxic situation, and the environment 100% is deteriorating. But I think that a degree of that is almost natural. Like Brute DeForest and I talked about this, like with the microplastics and xenoestrogens and endocrine disruptors. It's almost like thinking that that's destroying life is kind of a bad philosophy to take. Like it's one thing to recognize the harms of all of the toxic things in the environment, but then it's another to avoid life because of it. So
Mm.
I think there's definitely ways to work through it. And I like I mentioned earlier, Georgi Dinkov, who actually lives in Washington, D.C., kind of fighting the forces on the real physical level that he I think he brought up in an interview with I did an interview with him. He was pretty much talking about like the toxicity where he was living, and there is something to just kind of uh going against it while you're or almost like keeping your friends close, keeping your enemies closer with the environment. It sounds kind of hilarious, but yeah, I think it's never good to be a never good to view your environment as something that's inherently harmful. I do think it's just about the energy flow.
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk about this. I'm glad you mentioned Brute, because I think with all of this stuff, you need a dialectical view, right? You need to be neither here nor there. So it's like, does nutrition matter? Yes. Does environment matter? Yes. Simultaneously, does it matter? No, right? Like it sounds paradoxical, but that is the attitude you need to have because you think about there's a lot of talk recently about testosterone, right? Like for the past declining testosterone levels and what the social and political ramifications of that. Um, think about think about like Captain Cook or these explorers who like Magellan. Let's take Magellan. That's a great example. First person to circumnavigate the world, right? He's on a boat. They've got no food. They're having to boil leather and eat it. They're having to, eat whatever rats they can find on board the ship. What do you reckon his testosterone levels were, right? What do you reckon the
Yeah.
cortisol? That man did something truly great. He named, the Pacific Ocean. He circumnavigated the globe. He died, on his mission. His T levels would have been absolutely like fucked. And the point is that he did something great because at a certain point, it doesn't even matter, right? But when you're getting started, I think that it does. But that's, I think, when people continue to obsess over these things, like, oh, is the environment totally correct? Or that's just, if you're think that way, sure, know the dangers, but at a certain point, you need to leave all that behind because you can't use that. You can't approach life like that.
Yeah, it's almost like for me the thing was your intuition will kind of tell you that this is the case. Like I think pursuing something that is a lofty goal or something that's clearly causes you to deteriorate yourself mentally, emotionally, physically. You will offset that when you're on the mission, and that's kind of what I talked about with the brute, because that's totally the whole thing to think about is that the mission is your nourishment. You know, there's no nourishment that's better than that. Because I think we talked about this where like a body could have cancer, and really, if it's able to um, if you're able to keep yourself moving, however that works, have purpose, have the mission, I don't think any of the physical issues are really as harmful. And it almost works the opposite way, like when you're not on the mission or when you don't have the proper environment. Really, that's when the nutrition and the focus on metabolism doesn't really have the ability to actualize itself.
Yeah, I guess you could say there is, without a doubt, a physical aspect to the metaphysical, or there's a physical aspect to the spiritual. In order to first get the mission, and like you said, the mission doesn't, you don't choose the mission chooses you. You need to be intuitive in order for it to choose you in the first place, which means you need to have your health in order. But I think what happens is at some point you need to sort of reject biological materialism and recognize there is actually a sort of spiritual dimension to life that transcends, uh, T levels or this or that, like hormones. At some point, it's like the mission actually is a sort of transcendental thing, and it brings you above all of that more base material biological reality.
Exactly. Yeah, it's I think Aristotle and William Blake both had the idea that the soul couldn't be viewed outside of the body, or essentially like the body is the soul is part of the body. So like I actually tend to think that the hormones are something that are extremely useful at getting at these unexplainable concepts that I think we're never going to have a grasp of. Really, the divine emanates through, and if you could focus on all you have control over, really essentially just the locus of control, that's I think all there is to really worry about. Like that's why I say that like I think the only thing to optimize in life is the physical flow of energy. That's all there is to do.
Mhm. And then obviously, you think there's a spiritual dimension to that. I've heard you talk about intuition and your conception of like God. So maybe you could go into that a bit.
Yeah, I think first started understanding um like the concept of God just through dealing with the most terrible health issues with my digestion. And it was probably just one night that I was just in pain, and all that I had to do was pray, just intuitively. That was all that I had left. And that was a moment that made me realize that the whole time I've been listening to my intuition, that is my connection to God. That is me reaching out into the unknown with like a complete faith and conviction. That's, I think, what you see in Michelangelo's painting of the hands of God in Adam, where there's these two hands reaching out, and it's that is the perfect example of I think what we're doing here on in life is trying to reach out to God, and there's no other way to explain it, I think, than in these divine terms, because really there's not much that could explain intuition in terms of, well, why do babies have intuition? You could say that it came from the parents, but there has to be some sort of larger context of creation through that, and that was a really powerful thing for me because the more that I've leaned into my intuition, the more that I have been able to give up to God and just give in to divine carelessness, which I think Bronze Age Pervert talked about, and yeah, that to me is just where life becomes effortless. That's another big thing that I really try to focus on because when you're at the highest state, when you are walking with God, that is what life feels like. So yeah, it's definitely a long process, and there's ups and downs, of course, but once you find it, I think all kind of anxiety and worry goes away, and you're able to pursue your true nature.
Whenever you talk about the link between intuition and divinity, I always think about the muses. You know that concept that artists speak about, that they don't come up with the idea. It's like the idea is given to them by the muses,
Totally.
by the gods. And in this case, right, like you could say uh, essentially what they're talking about is that they have an instinct or an intuition to do something that they feel like is not really theirs, that it came from something outside of themselves, and that they have described that in divine terms, right, in spiritual terms, as being visited by gods. Like that's something I definitely think about when you speak about intuition and divinity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's like David Lynch had a similar idea with that, where he sees creativity. I think he was talking about this in the context of making films, where he'll have like a daydream, and there will be someone in another room that's cutting off pieces of the finished film, and they're throwing him scenes, and he's just getting the scenes by thinking on them, by visualizing it. And slowly but surely, more and more pieces are being dropped to him, and he's actually turning that into the full film that was already planned. And to me, that's what metabolism is. Really, things in the environment are coming through you, flowing through you. You are digesting, you are metabolizing, you're turning it into real matter, turning the potential into actual. That's the whole point. And it's a beautiful process to witness.
I think I started listening to Rick Rubin because of you.
Oh yes. Yeah, he is I think one of the greatest exemplars of intuition. It's funny because I have always liked him, but I never really knew much about his background until I just started to get the sense that he doesn't he doesn't really um, he doesn't really need to worry about experience because like I said, I think intuition is very roughly based on past experience. I do think it's about reaching into the future, or essentially like William Blake's idea of the imagination, where the imagination is something that creates reality, and it's not necessarily a irrational thing. Like really, like I think another thing might have said was that thought is act. An inactive thinker is just a dreamer, and an unthinking doer is, I forget exactly what he said. An unthinking doer is an animal, or I don't know exactly what he said, but it was something to the effect of like when your metabolism, this is where I was seeing it as, is when your metabolism is flowing, that's when anything that you imagine is actually able to be turned into something real.
Hmm. And I think that that's all you can do. That's what Brood says. All you can really do, right, is take the thoughts in your head and make them a reality, right? Like that creative process is in some ways like how one finds meaning in life.
Totally.
Yeah. One of the ideas I liked by Rick Rubin was this idea that creativity is a sort of end in itself, and that it doesn't really matter if it's not making you money. It is an end in itself. So you don't need to. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, well, it's funny because William Blake had a thought on this too, where he thought that art and money could never coexist. And I was trying to think about that because with all the stuff that I've been working on for the past bit, I haven't necessarily pursued money per se, but it's almost been a fruit of my labor, where people have come to me, and that's how I started doing consulting, and I do consulting now. So like anyone who's trying to like improve their metabolism, deal with digestion or stuff, like they can reach out, we can do calls. But that was all just an intuitive thing. Like it was almost for me pursuing my art in a sense that that became a thing. And so I had the idea that like art can produce money, but commerce can never produce art. So they
Mm.
almost it's because they operate on two different scales or two different yeah, two different paths essentially. But
That point about commerce, another point that he makes that I really like is that the second you're thinking about the audience, it's commerce, it's not
yep.
art. So I thought that perfectly explains why those Star Wars films were so bad. It's because you could tell they're thinking, well, how do we appeal not only to a European audience, but also to a Chinese audience? And what's going to get us the most cash? Like, that's not art, that's commerce. The end goal is not creating a beautiful work of art like George Lucas did. The end goal is making a bag.
Exactly. That's why like Marvel movies are essentially products, they're not films. Like that's it's another funny thing. It was I'm trying to remember. It was I think it was Rick Rubin talking about this where he was saying like if you go into or no, it was Young Lean talking about this, where he said if you go into a project trying to make something for your audience, even if it's not with the intent of commerce, but if you have some sort of creative act, you're just guessing essentially. You don't know what people want. So
Mm.
if you make what you want and you like it, that's actually when it resonates with other people. And yeah, it's been powerful, at least for me, where I wasn't really getting that many views in the beginning, but just slowly but surely, it started upregulating. And I think it's because I knew the whole time that what I was putting out, I could confidently say, "Oh, this is good stuff. Like I like this." And yeah, it's just I think about fully expressing what you wish to express. And like we were talking about before with just the metabolism, there's 100% these physical issues I think impair that for a person, but as you slowly but surely move through your health issues, I think it's important to just really put out whatever you can. It doesn't even matter for the quality, and it's a hard thing to just say because it's not advice. It really isn't advice. It's something that happens to you. You just end up needing to express what you have to express, and if the quality's bad, that's just part of what keeps it flowing. And then the flow of energy is what eventually structures it. Like it's Ray's thesis in action when it comes to art and creativity.
Well, it doesn't matter, right? What you put out, so long as it's not being done for commercial reasons, because that would be the difference. Is if you started putting out content because you thought, well, hey, here's how I make a buck. Like, because you can tell when people start doing that. Like on Twitter right now, a lot of people are engagement farming for Elon bucks. That I feel like is bad, but. I was I think the advice to people, like I think creativity is generative, right? It's almost like the epitome of generative, creating something, like creating a life if you're a parent, creating a piece of art, creating a podcast, whatever it is it's generative. It's in order to do it, you need a sort of abundance of energy. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that you can get is just do what you want. Like right now, I guarantee you, there's a number of things that you'd be interested in listening to or watching or reading, but they just don't exist, right? You've probably had it before where you're searching for something and you can't find it, or even on the internet with its abundance of content. And then it's like, well, you're interested in it, make it. And you've got a guaranteed audience of one, which is you. You're guaranteed to like it, and I think that that's when the best work is done. So, like I recently I did this 10-hour podcast on the discovery of Australia, and I knew for a fact that in total probably only 6, 7 people listened to the full thing. But for me, it was I I was always interested. It's like here I am, I'm speaking English in what is undeniably like, an Anglo-Saxon culture, but I'm on the other side of the world. So I walk through like a shopping mall, um, and it's like 40 degrees in December, and the radio is playing a song about it snowing, right? Like
Hmm.
how it's this upside down world that I'm living in, and then you just stop and you think like, how the hell did we get here? And that's like a 2000 plus year story that I don't think anyone had told in the way that I told it. And it's like, okay, yeah, six people listen to that. That's fine. Because at the end of the day, it's like I was interested in working out like how I got here, right?
Exactly, dude. The fact that you said that, because that has been huge for me of just creating what you want to exist, because no one else is more qualified than you. And even if someone else was more qualified, they don't have the energetic drive to do it. So that's, I think, proof that really the energy flow is the whole thing to focus on. And you can make tons of mistakes, you can do a terrible job, but really, it's like William Blake said, like the tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction, or wiser than horses of instruction. Or I think even better would be like what he said about the fool who persists in his follies becomes wise. And
Hmm.
it's kind of
Yeah.
funny because Blake was relatively um, unsuccessful for most of his lifetime, and I think that's similar with Nietzsche too. And I think a lot of thinkers who are doing important work or creatives who are doing important work generally don't see the fruits of their labor. And that to me was just proof that like a lot of times your work or what you're doing right now, it does transcend where you actually are. So it's like so silly to even think about just the effect of what's going on with the culture, or people picking up on it. Of course, that's a great thing, but it should not be the primary focus to me. I think it's like it's something to be aware of the audience or of being aware of people who are possibly consuming what you create, but to not be influenced by it. Really, just to know and then create what you want to make anyway.
Hmm. Yeah, that William Blake quote is so good. This idea of what is it? The wrath of lions is
All right,
greater
yeah,
than the
no,
horses of instruction. Is that right?
the tigers of wrath, yeah, are
Oh,
wiser than the horses of instruction.
yeah, it's 100% true. Insofar, like that's actually genuinely something that it's a weird thing to regret, but I do think about times in my life where perhaps was overly self-conscious and analytical in the way that I approach the world. And I've definitely found, like, as I've gotten a bit older, like that overthinking side becoming less prevalent, and that's been a great blessing.
Totally. It's funny you say that because like I've found a similar thing where I think on a long enough time span of me trying to create things, when I was younger, probably like 18, it was difficult for me to not think about how people would receive stuff that I create or how they'd critique me or what they'd think of it. And honestly, I think for me, one of the things that kind of let me stop caring was just through dealing with like a terrible state of health where I didn't really have much to care about besides my physical state. So why would I care what someone thinks of something that I'm doing when I have way bigger problems to deal with than that? So I think like that manifests itself differently for each person, but like I think it's like really a blessing to go through any sort of struggle or hardship. I don't necessarily think it's vital for the art or creativity itself, but I think it is something that you do need to run through, and just see your greater vision. And I think it's just the struggle serves as the stimulus of pushing you forward towards that.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's definitely a common trend among great thinkers or a common characteristic of great thinkers. Like you obviously know that Nietzsche suffered from terrible, like chronic ill health for his entire life, basically.
Yeah.
Oh well, I actually reckon that's almost a good place to leave it. I reckon that last part was particularly good.
Yeah.
Is there any I don't know any other thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that learning more about the bioenergetic philosophy or just like essentially metabolism and energy flow is I think something that will benefit someone so far beyond health and nutrition, like we've kind of been talking about this whole time. And It's just been so powerful for me in particular, and seeing other people start to have a grasp of energy flow. Because again, I really think that there's always hope, and life should be effortless. And just reaching for that state is all there is to do. And that's again, that's I think the whole purpose of what we're doing here, just following intuition and living out the mission, living out your true nature. So yeah, I mean, appreciate it, Russell. I mean, this has been great. So,
Well, there was actually one last thing that I wanted to
oh
mention
yes,
about consciousness, right? Where you think about in the Garden of Eden, right? The fact that Adam and Eve were not conscious, right? Until they
exactly.
ate the forbidden fruit. Again, there's this idea that the divine state is the instinctual one, and that consciousness is in some ways a curse. So, anyway, that's the again that idea that divinity is linked with intuition. But yeah, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Nate. It's been a great conversation.
Appreciate it, bro.